And now to my role of introducing our first keynote speaker of the conference, James Cairns. He is Senior Director for Strategic Engagements and Organizational Learning at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. He has been leading the center-wide efforts focused on understanding the early childhood ecosystem and the center's role in it, including developing strategic collaborations and partnerships, and leading efforts to understand and measure the impact of the center's work. I'm sure that many of you have visited the center's website. I hope you're receiving their newsletter and are using their materials. We know for sure that those tools and the way to frame the messages are being used in all corners of the world, have been translated in many, many languages. And it is a result of James' efforts to broker those partnerships with different groups, with different networks, with funders, with UN agencies, local organizations, local governments. And it has been a privilege for us at ESA as a network for Europe and Central Asia, together with peers from the other networks, the Arab Network, Asia Pacific, Africa Network, to work closely with James and his colleagues to reinforce the advocacy capacity of our networks. And he has been truly a friend in this journey, and we have learned a great deal from him in terms of how to frame the evidence. Through his work, he has been at the forefront of translating research into practice. And I know that his insights will challenge and inspire us as we kick off this conference. Please join me in welcoming James Cairns to the stage.
As Liana said, we've had just a really rich and rewarding collaboration with ESA and many of you and your colleagues in many countries, both formally over the last few years and informally for many, many years. Liana and I were remembering we first met at a consultative group on early childhood care and development meeting probably 13 or 14 years ago. So this has been a long journey, and it is a delight to be with you in person here at this conference and celebrating the 25th anniversary of ESA's network. The task that I've been given is to complicate your life. So as Liana said, and hopefully you all have used and are aware of the work that our center does, our core mission is really to take multiple sources and disciplines and bodies of knowledge about how child development happens and to integrate and synthesize that into a story that we all can use about why this is so important and what we can do about it to ensure that all children can thrive. If you've been tracking our center's material, you've noticed we've put a lot of new content out recently. You may have heard the phrase ECD 2.0 floating around. What I want to share today is work in progress. So this is still stuff we're working on to integrate these newer parts of the science that we're pulling together and start to tell a more integrated story that isn't 1.0 versus 2.0, but is an updated, integrated story of what the science is telling us. And the frame that we're working with is this idea of developmental environments. And I'll talk a little bit more, obviously, about that. At the end of my presentation, on the last slide, there's a QR code for a survey. This is work in progress. We, my colleagues and I, would love for you to take a couple of minutes and give us your unfiltered, honest feedback on how does this land with you? What's useful? What still feels uncooked or not usable in your own context? So you are part of the ongoing testing and improvement of how we talk about what we know. So, are you ready? Let's go. So, alongside ESA's 25 years has been 25 or 30 years of building this science-informed, core set of ideas that have shaped early childhood policies, programs, interventions across the world. In your countries, the work that you do, and other places. And it's grounded in three basic concepts. First, brain architecture. What we know about how the brain is built. We're born with all the cells we'll have in our brain and very few connections. And it is this interaction in the environment of the baby and that baby's brain as those synapses and skills are being formed, early skill foundations that get built upon over time. This happens in the environment of relationships and is shaped by early experience. One of the critical ways this happens is through serve and return. This idea, metaphor of volleyball, ping pong, tennis. Our friends in Brazil picked a soccer metaphor, bate-bola, the back and forth, of reciprocity between the infant and the child and adult caregivers. It's the way a baby's brain is reading its environment. Am I safe? Will someone respond to my needs? Is there care and support here? Are responsive relationships part of my environment? And the third core concept is this idea of toxic stress, that the body of research around the effects of stress and adversity on the body and the brain. And it's important, the toxic stress phrase is the one that has gone kind of global and viral. Sometimes what gets lost here is the fact that it's part of a taxonomy of stress. There is positive, important sort of stress that helps us build our coping mechanisms and our stress response system that's buffered by and in the context of those supportive relationships. It's only when that stress system is activated for a long time without that responsive caregiving that we start to see the toxic, the dangerous effects in brain development. So that's been the foundation of work that has driven this field, work we're going to celebrate this week in places around the world. And if we think back to the last 20, 25 years, where we were in early childhood development and where we are now, it's a remarkable achievement. And I think it's something that all of us should feel proud about. But the story doesn't stop here. And I think the work that our center's been trying to pull together, the growing and ever-changing and deepening bodies of knowledge, are moving in two directions. So this new story, this updated story we want to talk about, has two dimensions that are sort of new to this. First, it's an ever-deepening understanding of human biology. I'm going to talk about a couple of points in that space. And then second, it's a broadening to understand how the broader developmental environments, built environments, natural environments, are shaping child development. So, first, in the biology. All of the stuff we've talked about in terms of brain development is also happening in multiple biological systems in our bodies. So when we talk about early experience, when we talk about the effects of stress and adversity, that's affecting the development of our immune systems, our metabolic systems, our neuroendocrine systems. So our body, surprise, is integrated and connected. And so this idea now that, and again, deepening research and knowledge, that these sensitive periods of human development aren't just in the brain. And so when we think about the foundations that are being set in these early years, it's as much about lifelong physical and mental health as it is about, oh, I forgot the way my slides were working. So I'm going to move through these. These are the three things I'm going to talk about. Timing and developmental environments. Okay, here we go. So this is as much a health story, and I'm delighted we have the Deputy Minister of Health with us this morning. The story of early development is as much a health story as it is a learning story. And so I think, again, as we think about the ecosystem that we're talking about, we have critical foundations for lifelong physical and mental health, and particularly around sort of long-term chronic diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, depression, some cancers. Many of them have their roots in what happens in our bodies if our stress systems are chronically elevated. High levels of ongoing inflammation created through our immune systems, the way the metabolic system processes energy that can lead to diabetes. So the first sort of new part of the story of the biology is we are a set of integrated, interacting systems, biological systems in the body. The second, and we've known this and talked about this, but to get a finer point on it, timing is critical. And again, that not just in the brain, but in other body systems, our lungs, other parts of our bodies, there is higher sensitivity in the prenatal period than later in life, that young children are more sensitive than older children, and adolescents, and adults. Part of what's happening, it's this sort of plasticity, this early sensitivity, so that as these systems are developing in their earliest states to set sort of the foundations that will get built on over time, there is particular both opportunity and risk. We can think of examples like lead. Lead is toxic for any of us, but the amounts of lead that have significant irreversible sort of health and developmental impacts in pregnancy and infancy are very different than if you or I were exposed to lead as full adults. Air pollution and the effects on lung development is another place where this kind of timing is really, really important. And so as we've talked for many years about the gene and environment interaction that is at the heart of child development, we now need to add timing. So it really is gene and environment and timing and how they interact together that is really critical for what happens in terms of risk and positive development. So those are some of the key parts of this deepening understanding of our human biology. So let me move now to the sense of what we mean by developmental environments. So the environments that are influencing development are shaping experiences and exposures. And so, very simply, a developmental environment is the full range of experience and exposures a child is having in the places where they live and learn and grow and play. I think the important thing to pull out here is a lot of our work has been focused and talked about early experience. What that child is experiencing in its life, in that environment of relationships with caregivers and so forth. I think the key word here that's new for us to think about, and not new, is this idea of exposures. What's out there and happening in the broader environment that is having direct biological effects on the child? And we're going to get into some of this. So that's this piece, I think, as we think about this broader developmental environment, this idea that what surrounds us shapes us, quite literally. And so we talk about this in three kind of cycles. Here, to give appropriate props to the Uri Bronfenbrenner ecological model, we're sort of filling this in some additional ways. So first, the idea of the social environment. This is the one we've worked in and talked about for a long time, where we talk about relationships, we talk about the social connections, human capital, community supports, the role that faith and culture can play in building a positive developmental environment. This is a space, and again, if you've been following our recent work, where we're really starting to kind of dig in. The built and natural environment. So what's happening in housing, in neighborhoods, issues of green space, access to transportation, to healthy food, to employment. In the natural environment, air quality, water quality, issues of temperature and heat. So these are the places where there are exposures, good or bad, positive or negative, that are having direct effects on child health and development, and have important indirect effects because they're also affecting the adult caregivers. And so as we think about these exposures and these things happening in the built and natural environment, they are happening to the adult caregivers just as much as they are happening to the child. And then finally, working out broadly to a set of systemic influences. So things like the current and historic policies and laws and regulations in our societies, issues of structural inequity, access or lack of access to the healthcare system, quality education systems, the cycles of poverty. And the important thing here is that these influences have been shaped in our societies, and they create situations that affect kids and families unequally. And these are not distributed randomly, and they're not distributed equally. And so it's an important part of how we have to understand some of the forces that are working in these developmental environments in which we are working on programs and services and policies for kids. And so bringing these things into how we understand and think about what is influencing and having an impact on the children and families we work with. Let me just pull one example out of here to go into just a tiny bit more. So this idea of green space. And there's a rich body of knowledge that's growing. And I should say, what I'm sharing with you isn't new research. These are bodies of evidence and knowledge that have been building over many years. And part of what we're doing is trying to bring these pieces of evidence and knowledge that have sat in a health and clinical setting or sat in an environmental setting and weave it into what we understand and how we talk about the things that affect child health and development. So, again, there's a robust body of knowledge that's continuing to grow about the association of having access to green spaces and how that it promotes better physical and mental health, it lowers stress, can lower rates of obesity and diabetes, increased physical activity, ideas of kids in nature and tactile learning and being outside. Green space also mitigates extreme heat, as well as noise and air pollution. Now, there's a key word here. We're talking about safe green space. And so for these positive benefits to occur, green space has to exist, it has to be accessible, and it has to be safe. And what we know is those qualities have been influenced by the structural inequities that exist in all of our societies. So which children have access to these kinds of spaces for these benefits is not randomly distributed. And we need to be honest about that, and we need to take that seriously because it's affecting our ability to move this work forward. I want to pause here and also acknowledge what Liana started with this morning, that when we talk about developmental environments in this work that I'm sharing, I have to acknowledge that right now, hundreds of thousands of children's developmental environments are an immediate existential threat to their survival. And so none of this, in a sense, in this moment matters. And we need to understand that, and we need to be continuing to figure out how do we work to tackle that and be aware of that. And that even in those moments, we know there are parents and adult caregivers who are pouring every ounce of their being into doing whatever they can to keep their children safe. So every developmental environment, yours, mine, every child's, is a mix, a combination of positive and negative experiences and influences. And so, again, we've talked about these are not distributed randomly, that the qualities of these environments are shaped by and deeply rooted in our own public policies, our social histories. The good news here is we've shaped them, which means we can reshape them. These aren't fixed things. And then I want to just touch briefly on two major systemic influences from that outer ring that are really affecting developmental environments right now. So, continuing to come back to this question of structural inequity, and then also to look briefly at climate change. I want to take two examples, one in each area. So, if you're not familiar with this, a group in the United States called Diversity Data Kids has created a Child Opportunity Index. They have, this is a subset, they have 35 or 36 indicators that are looking at the resources and conditions in the places where kids live. So you see things in the education, access to good education opportunities, things in the physical and environmental health, toxic exposure, opportunities for social and economics. So they have gone out and collected the data on this index in 72,000 neighborhoods in the United States, in the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the US. And so what they've found is there's significant variation in different parts of the US, but most profoundly, the difference between neighborhoods, even in the same city, is drawing a stark and explicit example of the kind of inequity that gets built in to our societies. So just as one example, in a Midwestern city, two neighborhoods, 8 miles apart. Neighborhood number one, oh, I should say that the index, they norm all of these and they create a 100-point scale. So 100 is perfect, no neighborhood is perfect. So neighborhood number one has a Child Opportunity Index of 7 on a 100-point scale. Neighborhood number two, 8 miles away, 73. And I probably don't have to tell you, you can probably guess. Neighborhood 2 is majority white. Neighborhood 1 is majority African American. And so in the US context, obviously a lot of our structural inequity is around race and racism. But this kind of index helps us understand how that's built into where people live, what they have access to, and what they're exposed to. So this is the kind of tool, I think, and I wouldn't be surprised if in many of your countries that you all or others are trying to do these kinds of things. But these are the kinds of tools that help us see that inequity and then help us tackle it. When we turn to climate change, again, just want to keep coming back to this point that all of these aspects of developmental environments have both the direct effect on the child and its own health and development, and this indirect effect of what's happening to a caregiver and their ability then to provide the kind of responsive, supportive caregiving that we know children need. And again, without having a lot of time, I'm going to take one example of how in the natural environment, what climate change is doing is, in a sense, accelerating and exacerbating the effects in the natural environment. So let's look at extreme heat. We know the dangers of extreme heat and excessive heat in certain populations. Most of the time, publicly, our focus is the risk for elderly people. But we also have a very robust body of evidence around the significant impacts of excessive heat on particularly infants and toddlers. But often those effects are less visible, and I'm going to get into some details. And so we need to start to talk about and bring this body of knowledge to bear on understanding the specific sensitivity and vulnerability that young kids have as we start to see more and more examples of extreme heat days in so many parts of the world. And so it's both that effective heat happens in the moment, but again, we're talking about rapidly developing, highly sensitive biological systems. So there's also an effect that's happening in the way that that system is exposed to that heat early that has longer-term consequences. There are themes here I think you're hearing, right? These are parts of things. So let's look at 4 areas where, again, there's a rapidly growing body of knowledge and evidence of the effects of heat. I should also say, we have a working paper on this topic that's on our website. There's some really, really interesting biology at the molecular level of how heat proteins function, which is way outside my area of expertise. But I think it's fascinating, and it's really important to understand the biology of this. So, effects in fetal development. So high temperatures can reduce blood flow in the pregnant person, the risks of dehydration, activation of inflammation. All of these things increase the risks of poor birth outcomes, preterm, low birth weight, and so forth. And we know that preterm birth, low birth weight babies have other developmental challenges in terms of respiratory infections, sensitivity to disease, and other kinds of things. So thinking about the effect that heat has on during pregnancy. Oops, sorry, this is not animated. Learning loss. Again, bodies of knowledge that are showing that heat slows our cognitive function. It reduces our ability to concentrate. We get more irritable. You can imagine young children who don't sit still really well anyway. If it's hot, that irritability, you've all been in hot classrooms probably, right? It's unpleasant. The other thing here is the next point, is that disrupted sleep also has significant impacts on learning ability. Sleep disruption, our bodies are built to go into a cooling stage as a way of easing into sleep. And so if the temperature in the space stays too high, it makes sleep disrupted, poor. It's true for the parents too, not just for the kids. And again, so that we saw that also feeds into learning, it feeds into emotional behavioral disruptions. And then finally, the body reads excessive heat as a threat. So it's activating the stress response system. And so therefore, all of the kind of behavioral, mental health kinds of effects we know of excessive stress activation are part of why heat is affecting kids in these kinds of ways. It's also, there's association with excessive heat and increased sort of crime and violence and social disruption. People are more aggressive and irritable, honestly, when it's hot. Right, so all of these things are creating this kind of disruptive thing. So this is about heat. There are similar stories that we can tell about air quality, about water quality. So these are the factors in the natural environment that are having these direct effects on children's biology and development that are getting accelerated and enhanced through climate change. Okay. So this is the updated story when we're trying to talk about developmental environments and things in this combination of positive experiences and exposures that children are facing that expand how we need to think about and talk about what's important for healthy child development. And so what I want to do is just take kind of 3 illustrations of how this body of knowledge can help us think about what an ecosystem approach might look like as we try to foster supportive developmental environments. Now, I don't know if you've done this, but we use the word ecosystem all the time. I thought I probably should go look to see how it's defined. And there are a bunch of definitions you can find, but all of them had 3 elements to them. So an ecosystem is a geography. It is the full set of all of the different living things, elements that exist in that geography, and it is the interactions and relationships that affect them with each other. So we can talk about an ecosystem being place-based, holistic, and interactive. So let's think about what that looks like and how we would think about bringing that into how we think about child development. And is this a way to help us start to think in some new and challenging and I think hopefully exciting ways? I also want to acknowledge that this the science in this knowledge base is only one source of knowledge and information that we need to draw on as we're thinking about these approaches. And so combining that with practical experience and practical knowledge, lived experience, the experience and histories of communities. So we need to see how these things fit together. But I also want you all to think of this as a set of eyeglasses, a set of lenses through which we can kind of look at the work that we do, the contexts we're in, and where we might see opportunities to take on and think in new ways. So, 3 illustrations. I think I'm still okay on time. So first, we've talked a lot about the science of resilience over the years, and the importance that, at least in a US cultural context, where we think of resilience as a trait, you are either resilient or you're not. And we've tried to break that down and talk about resilience as an interaction, as a combination of factors that are built over time, and used the scale as a metaphor to help us understand that it's this balancing of those positive and negative experiences and exposures in our lives, and thinking of, resilience is this positive response in the face of significant adversity. And the importance of this fulcrum, which is set, at least in part, by genetics. You can think of it as temperament, but is not fixed. And right, on a scale or a seesaw, where that fulcrum sits will affect how easily that thing tips in one direction or another. So we've talked a lot about this. You can see some of the things that are important sort of positive factors to build resilience as we face the kinds of negative experiences and exposures. One of the, I think, challenges and feedback that we've gotten from folks and that we've wrestled with internally is this frame for resilience can often put unfair burden on a family and a parent to produce resilient outcomes in their child when they are facing huge sources of adversity that are outside their control. And so there's a danger of reinforcing kind of a family, good parents make good kids, bad parents make bad kids, right? Sort of frame, which is too present in our society. So I want us to think about how does this idea of developmental environments influence how we understand resilience. And so that all of these experiences and exposures that I've been talking about that happen in this broader set of the developmental environment are acting on this resilience scale. So we need to see how those exposures in the natural environment, the built environment a child is living in, the systemic influences, these are all active factors in how we think about and what the opportunities are for resilience. And I think if we start to work this way and see how these things interact, it will help us talk about this in a way that doesn't activate, if you will, that assumption that somehow it's up to the parent to produce a resilient child. So that's one thing. I think that this idea of developmental environments gives us an opportunity to really talk in a more sophisticated and appropriate way about how we think about and how we work to build resilience. Second, we need to broaden the list of policy domains that are seen as affecting early childhood. So I hope through this conversation, you weren't thinking, oh my God, now I need to figure out how to be an expert in housing policy. I need to know how to do environmental risk assessments. That's not what we're talking about here. That's impossible. So really, as we think about where we're going to try and continue to build a science-informed strategy for how we invest in young children and families to create these supportive development environments, we need to start to bring in new partners and actors in these kinds of fields who are working in these kinds of natural and built environmental contexts. Let me just give 2 examples of how I've seen in some direct work that this can work. And I'm sure many of you in your own contexts, and we'll hear a lot of stories through the next couple of days around this. So first, our center has done some work over the past year or so with the city of Boston, our hometown. And they were really interested in this intersection between extreme heat and child development. And so the mayor's office pulled together a dozen or so people from across city agencies. And it was fascinating. And so what happened in this conversation is the environmental health people really learned more specifically about this science of how excessive heat gets activated and what it does in young children. And the early childhood folks and the environmental health folks started talking to each other. So the early childhood folks know where all the daycare centers and preschools in the city are located. And the environmental health folks know where the heat islands are in the city, which neighborhoods get hotter and have higher temperatures, less green space, and so forth. And so they basically put their maps on top of each other. And so the environmental health people, who are already mandated to set up cooling centers on days of extreme heat in the city, knew and could figure out where they could locate those centers so that families with young children could have easy access to them. So what do we have happening now in the city? They've rewritten their heat advisories to really emphasize the important sensitivities and risks for pregnant people and young children. And they're starting to co-locate their cooling centers closer to and in facilities where kids and families go. It didn't require any new program, any new budget. It brought a new actor to the table who started to understand that they have a role to play in the work they're already doing to improve the developmental environment for those children. Secondly, I've had a chance to do some work over the past year or two with the city of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And again, the mayor, the city administration has launched a really significant, multifaceted early childhood initiative with a vision of that being the best city on the entire continent in which to raise children. The steering committee for that initiative has 17 city departments that sit on that steering committee. Transport, green design, housing authority, finance. And again, they're not asking the transport department to run daycare centers. They're asking the transport department to figure out traffic flow so they can block streets off on Sundays so families and kids have places to play and ride bikes and do all that kind of stuff. So again, I think there's an opportunity here as we bring this broader developmental environment lens to bear of inviting in, setting a table that has more seats at it, where other parts of our systems can start to see how they and the work that they do can have a direct effect on the quality of life for kids and families. And so this kind of coordinated strategy, I think, is a way that we can start to shift and reshape the systems, the policies, the practices that we've talked, that have kind of shaped our current reality and situation, and work towards sort of better access, better opportunity. And then finally, I want to close with just a word about how we can think about what does this integrated systems approach kind of look like. And I want to finish kind of where I started with a metaphor. So we've talked about the body as this set of integrated biological systems. This is from a video, a still from a video that's on our website, which I love. It sets these biological systems up as a team. Each player has a little card that talks about their skills. And so the key here is not that we're expecting any of us to do everything, but that almost anyone, any sector, any office, any department can do something. And the idea here is that each of our biological systems are highly specialized, but they're working together towards a common outcome, which is that we as a person are adapting and surviving and thriving in whatever environment we find ourselves in. And so I think we can think about this metaphor in how we think about and start to work on a more integrated systems approach and how we can bring additional actors to the table and invite them to join the team. The other part here is that what's good for young children is good for adults and is good for our societies. And so by bringing folks together, we can say it's for children, but it's really for all of us. And it's for the sustainability and the prosperity and the thriving of our societies. So that's, I think, the opportunity. And I hope that this expanded story doesn't make us feel, oh my God, there's so much more I have to figure out. Let's think about it as an opportunity to invite more people in so that together we can create these developmental environments where all children can thrive. So, here's the QR code. Please, I'm also going to post the link to this survey on the LinkedIn page for this conference. I'm really serious. Honest feedback. You represent the most important audience and set of actors that we produce this material for. So, we'd love to have your thoughts on this, where this works, where it's challenging. And I hope that these insights, these new lenses for what we know about what affects child development and health, we can take into our conversations over the next couple of days, celebrating the amazing work we are doing, and as we grapple with the challenges we still face, so that all children can thrive. Thank you very much.